The original Crash Bandicoot series isn't one that's especially known for its boss fights, but its cast of villains has nonetheless come to become pretty beloved over the years, with a lot of the characters making big first impressions and becoming memorable regardless. For this list, we'll be going in order chronologically through the games rather than from worst to best, but we'll be scoring them in several categories numerically, and making a tier list out of the 16 original boss fights at the end of the video. Most of these categories are pretty self-explanatory. Boss weaknesses are how bosses are damaged and defeated. Atmosphere is a mixture of factors like the arena, sound design, and environmental storytelling, that kind of stuff. Music is only worth 5 points instead of 10, so the max score is 55. With that out of the way, let's begin with the first and worst boss. Not a very surprising pick if you know anything about classic Crash. A generic caricature of a tribal man. He has a single attack of slamming down his staff and spinning around with it, and it's really easy to avoid. If you want, you can even jump on top of his throne where he can't hit you at all. He's too lazy to move from his position in the middle of the arena and just casually spins at a very leisurely pace like a lazy bum. It doesn't even really look like he's trying to attack you, it's more like he's trying to perform some kind of weird cult ritual or something. The most threatening attack he has that might be able to catch you by surprise for a cheap hit is him falling on top of you when he dies. It's more threatening dead than alive. Even for a first boss, this is pretty pathetic. For how difficult the first game is in general, the bosses are very weirdly easy. This comes across as something resembling a tutorial, but you've already cleared a decent couple levels by this point. I've seen people defend first bosses a lot, like in the comments on my DK video, where it's like, oh, it's the first boss, you shouldn't be so hard on it, it's supposed to be easy like that. Do you want a super hard boss with a million attacks for the first thing a player fights? That's dumb. But even within this video on these bosses, we're going to get considerably better examples of first bosses that are still reasonable and not some super difficult, complicated boss. Papu Papu is just the bare minimum, he's way too simple. That all said, Papu Papu has more love than you'd expect for someone as stereotypical as him. He's the only character who's native to the islands where the first game takes place on, and many of the levels themed around his people are extremely difficult, like Lost City. These levels with his minions keep going long after you kill him. Clearly, they're trying to avenge the extremely important Papu Papu. I mean, clearly this man is willing to die to defend his sacred land by body slamming people when he dies. So obviously that just shows how devoted and beloved he is as a leader. But no, seriously, he's a terrible representative of these people. He gets a pathetic boss and then his levels are insanely hard, I don't get it. The devs of Crash 1 were constantly having to tone down the difficulty because of playtesters. In the Japanese release, Papu Papu takes 5 hits to kill instead of 3. This series is made by Westerners, so they actually tried to improve it, make him slightly more difficult in a later release. While he gets no new attacks, on hits 4 and 5 he spins around slightly faster, so they at least did something. In the Sane Trilogy remake, they used this version of the boss since it's blatantly just an improvement. Regardless, the differences are minor enough that it's not going to help him much. His music is pretty good if it ever gets going, but his boss fight is so easy and pathetic that it'll generally end in about 20 seconds of the version where he has 3 HP, before the good part ever begins. Atmosphere is his only other decent category, and that's more because of all of the levels featuring his minions than him personally. He has 1 attack, 2 if you count him falling on you. After he slams down his staff, you can jump down on him at any time, so that's about as basic of a weakness as you can get. He's almost always vulnerable. Ripperoo is actually likable by comparison to Papu Papu. He's a fan favorite who comes back a lot. His signature laugh is a stock sound effect that's used in a lot of other things, originating from Lady and the Tramp, and people have worried about that being a problem for him coming back, but it hasn't really inhibited him so far. He's back in Crash Rumble and everything. He would get more characterization in the second game, but even here in his debut, he's a crazed psycho kangaroo in a straitjacket. That's pretty cool. Ripperoo is clearly a failed experiment from Cortex's Evolvo Ray that shows what a mistake is supposed to look like. To attack him, you have to set off these TNT crates, which have a very long delay and hit Ripperoo as he comes close. It's a lot harder than it looks, because getting the timing right on when Ripperoo will be jumping past when the TNTs have such huge delays is difficult. While you're unlikely to die from damage, This boss arena has the constant threat of instantly falling into the water and dying. For some reason, the TNTs in this boss fight are different from regular TNTs. Instead of that 3, 2, 1 countdown that you can see on the box, they just say Big TNT without giving player feedback on when they're gonna explode. They still take roughly the same amount of time to blow up as an ordinary TNT, so it's weird and makes it harder to time your hits. If they wanted bigger TNT, could they not just take generic TNT and make it bigger? This just seems unnecessary. Considering most of this boss is just hurting him, he gets a better boss weakness score, but all his attacks consist of are just jumping around in a set predictable pattern. Like he's particularly trying to hit you. But at least that makes more sense here when Ripperoo is supposed to be crazy, unlike Papu Papu who just comes across as lazy and stupid. There's just a random waterfall in the background that's not particularly tied to Ripperoo as a character. Like, yeah, it's cool, it's well done, but like, the TNT just happens to be washing down. It's not anything Ripperoo is actively doing, it's just kind of there. So I don't really think it's that thematic as it could be. Ripperoo is still a great character, but he could get a little bit better than this, which we'll see in his next encounter. Koala Kong is Cortex's first attempt at making a strong man, investing all into the muscles at the expense of the brains. He works in Cortex's minds and puts it to use in his boss battle, throwing boulders at Crash. This is our first boss who actively looks like he's trying to attack you, which is nice, although the random TNT that rains down from above is probably the bigger threat. He would be impossible to hit if he didn't constantly keep flexing all the time to show off his muscles, which gives him a nice sense of character. To damage Kong, you have to spin the boulders he throws back at him. Minecarts are constantly going between the two of you, and they can block the boulders you spin at Kong from hitting him. Combined with the hazardous TNT, it's not always a mindless free hit at every moment of Kong's vulnerability. You have to rush to hit the boulders before the TNT goes off, but you also have to wait for the minecarts to pass. Forcing the player to not be too slow or fast helps make them pay attention. Kong very rarely comes back in the series after this, mostly due to being redundant with Tiny. Tiny's great and all, but this fight is pretty memorable in its own right, so it would have been nice for them to find something for Kong to do beyond just be a clone of Tiny in Crash Bash. Koala Kong is relatively good by the standards of bosses in the original trilogy. He doesn't have any particularly bad category. The 2.5 in difficulty is relatively high by the very low standards of Crash Bandicoot boss. Of Cortex's original 3 animal lieutenants, Pinstripe is the only sane one, and is put in charge of Cortex's nuclear power plant. He has barrel-thrower Potteroo gangster minions like him leading up to him in the level that takes place before you fight, which help to add some lore to him and make him a somewhat more interesting opponent. Once we get to see the man himself, we get to see Crash Bandicoot is a bit edgier than something like Mario, with the man shooting directly out of a Tommy gun directly at Crash. Nope, it's not a stupid laser pistol or something, no censorship here. He's shooting you with a realistic gun. This was back in 1996, which was more of a no-no for family games like this one, and it definitely helps to make him a lot more memorable. That's the main thing carrying him here. He's a stereotypical gangster in a suit, and he laughs at shooting you to death, and you have to hide behind cover. Crash plays its cringing animation when standing behind the cover to try to convey it, and it's a funny visual. But once you realize this has turned into a cover shooter, this boss is basically over. This is pretty much just a glorified cutscene. This is more for spectacle than anything else, and he's only gonna get some cheap kills against players who don't know how the boss works. It doesn't look like the cover is big enough to even protect Crash, it's just kind of arbitrary, once you realize that it magically blocks the bullets when you go behind it. And no, you cannot dodge the bullets by running away from them. You must use the cover. So this boss could really use some more work from a mechanical standpoint. They put a lot of work into animations on this character, giving him flashy backflips and stuff as he moves around and a cool laugh. Score-wise, this boss is all flash, no substance. Crash 1 in general is much more atmospheric with the progression through the islands instead of warp rooms, enabling for more environmental storytelling. And that does help him, having a lead up to him and those gangster minions. He's a memorable character, but he's a very, very forgettable boss. Brio is Cortex's right-hand man, but is supposedly more competent than he is, being designed as a foil for Cortex. He made the evolve array that made the characters out of the previous normal animals that they were, and has the much more competent boss battle by comparison to Cortex. He's the more stereotypical mad scientist of the two, but they do a very good job selling it with his arena that he's serious, and not some generic comic relief scientist. You can see the island out his window that he's been terrorizing with an ominous red sky. And on the floor, there's that cool image of him with a skull emblem in place of his face. He is the first boss on our list to actually do multiple phases, and his gigantic health bar leaves a strong first impression. He'll throw potions at you with his basic attack, and some of them will turn into slimes. Killing them will deplete his health bar for some reason. The slimes are relatively easy to kill, although as a kid at first I didn't realize you had to jump on them only and that spinning wouldn't work for whatever reason. He has multiple patterns of how he throws the potions, and towards the end of throwing green potions, potentially some slimes can be out as he's finishing throwing out more exploding potions, making more obstacles to avoid at the same time. During this phase, if you go close up to Brio, he has the unique melee attack animation where he'll slam his beakers together to create an explosion and kill you. This is a nice touch beyond just generically touching the boss hurting you, like in a lot of other games. Once Brio gets to low health, he'll drink his potion to transform into a gigantic, over-muscled green monster man and rush towards you. Contact with him at all just hurts you as he comes forwards, which helps sell that he's actually powerful now, and not some comic relief muscle man or whatever. As he pounds the ground, pillars will fall from the ceiling that you have to jump on to go jump on his head. It makes some sense that his head is his weak point, because his frail scientist head didn't magically get buff or anything, just his body. It's a cool string of attacks, even if none of them are particularly hard to avoid. It makes for a memorable encounter. And Brio has always been my favorite of the Crash Bandicoot scientists, and this boss is a good part of the reason why. But the length and variety of attacks make this one stand out from the other bosses in the original trilogy. Cortex in the first game hasn't really developed into his own yet. He's really just kinda generic in the first game. Clancy Brown isn't voicing him yet, and his cutscenes are a lot more minimal compared to what he would get in Crash 2 and 3. Still, Cortex is a constant presence felt throughout the game, with all the random monitors in the lab showing his face being very funny and stupid looking, along with that portrait of him in Pinstripe's office. The arena for this boss fight is pretty cinematic looking, as you fight him on top of a blimp with a direct view of the whole island going up in flames, and Cortex is flying on his hoverboard thing. This is a good start, but the boss itself is slightly lackluster, unfortunately. He attacks by shooting projectiles from his gun. He doesn't only directly shoot you, but sometimes shoots his projectiles off-screen before they come in from the sides, as the bullets travel in strange arcs. All the projectiles are color-coded with their functions. Purple ones go straight at you, blue ones are the dangerous ones that come from the sides and are hard to avoid, and most importantly, green ones are the ones that you can spin to damage Cortex with. As the boss goes on, you'll need to spin more green ones before they arbitrarily damage Cortex. It doesn't make that much sense. The color-coded stuff is good to help make things more clear for the player, mostly because they need to communicate that the green projectiles can be spun attacks. However, when I see people play this for the first time, it still usually takes people a while to realize this property, and they just generically dodge for a few minutes. Once you do realize it, the boss is quite simple. All Cortex does is shoot these three projectile types, and for how much effort he puts into making harder to dodge patterns, you think he might notice that the green bullets are completely useless after he gets hit a few times. The patterns of projectiles get harder as his health gets lower and more projectiles come out, but it's just not that interesting visually by comparison to the other bosses before him. The atmosphere of the arena is the main thing carrying him as you orbit around the island on the blimp. I'm giving him a lower boss weakness score because of it not being clear to spin the green projectiles. It's kind of a weird solution for him to be hit, even if it is unique. Ripperoo returns in the sequel, having been demoted to the first boss this time. After the events of the first game, he has apparently become a scholar and is super intelligent despite being insane. He looks like some kind of stereotypical gentleman scholar with a top hat, cane, and mustache. His arena is drowning in books, and you interrupt him reading one when he first comes in. Immediately as you show up, he is still very clearly crazy, because he's still in his straitjacket and reading the book with his feet. Based off this one book here, he's apparently studying Crash and might have even learned from his past mistakes. This battle comes across a lot better than the other one because he is actively creating the TNT as he jumps around his cane like a pogo stick, as opposed to how he was doing it in Crash 1 without a care in the world and the TNT just washed down the river without him doing anything. When the TNT blows up, it will cause him to go crazy and lose his composure as he does his signature laugh and shows off some crazed inventor full head of hair underneath the hat. Then he goes around dumping nitro into the arena, which is deadlier than the TNT, because this can hurt you as soon as it's created, no waiting. You touch it, you die. The nitro is also its weakness, because when he blows it up, you can attack him to get rid of one of his 3 platformer boss hit points. The main negative thing about this boss is that it is the exact same thing every time. Although as a new player it may not be immediately obvious, and he does a decent job of easing a first-time player in by comparison to the dull Papu Papu. Each of the 6 times he lays out the explosives is different, and if you just run away from Riffaroo when he's laying nitros, it can kill a new player a couple of times who isn't careful. He's a serviceable first boss with a lot of personality. He's mostly just held back by his lack of variation, and the fact that he doesn't directly attack Crash and just kinda lays his explosives down wherever he feels like it. I don't like that the boss encourages being memorized so much, as there's just one safe place to stand and not get blown up by the end of it. It's one of the less impressive ones on replay. The Komodo Brothers are probably more suited to be the first boss than Riffaroo, having a very simple attack pattern. You would think being 2 they'd be harder, but no. They technically have a decent amount of attacks, with Mo, the fat one, throwing Joe, his brother, to spin around. The spin is really easy to avoid, and after a few seconds, Joe gets dizzy and you can attack him to make him hit Mo. The animation where Joe bumps into Mo is kinda janky. He kinda crawls along the ground awkwardly after being hit before bumping into Mo, making them both look very stupid. After damaging them, Mo starts rapidly throwing swords at the wall while very, very slowly rotating, for a pathetic and easily avoided attack. Even Papu Papu, for how lazy he is, spins much faster. Now, I'd be okay with it if he spun around slowly on the first phase and sped up later, but no, he doesn't change that. He still does it just as slowly every time. For the most part, the 2 brothers do not work together at all. They just get in each other's way. Mo just watches as Joe spins around lazily, only bothering to attack you with a melee sword swing if you go right up to him, not that anyone would ever do that. It's only on the final phase where Mo finally decides he's gonna attempt something resembling teamwork by throwing swords at you while Joe is spinning around. This one brief segment here is the only remotely threatening part of the boss where it's possible you might actually get hit. The manual for the game insists that Mo is dumb muscle and Joe is the brains. But if you actually bothered to look at this boss fight, it really seems like Joe is the one that's the idiot. Joe gets dizzy, randomly bumps into Mo, and causes the 2 of them to take damage. If Joe's not there, Mo theoretically couldn't even be hurt. Not to say that Mo is particularly intelligent either, but he comes across more as lazy than actively stupid like Joe does. Joe gets to show up later in Crash Team Racing with actual dialogue where he doesn't seem stupid.
Now you'll see I am the most feared driver on this circuit.
So based on this, fans took the word of God and decided Mo was stupid for no particular reason. Their comic relief routine of stupidly gassing each other up does give some character, and that very last phase is at least something for gameplay after all the build-up. I just wish it was longer than 4 seconds. Beyond them bundling things up, the arena and music is mostly just embracing the forgettable oriental stereotype of the boss and not doing much with it. Tiny Tiger makes a cool intro animation as he goes to smash through a big metal wall with his face on it, and he makes an intimidating roar before going to jump straight out of the Crash and crush him. With how tiny his legs are, you'd wonder why his main attack is jumping, but you're mostly just seeing those gigantic arms with those claw-like fingers as he jumps around, and he looks cool and menacing. For boss attacks, all Tiny ever does is just jump at you, so for attacks he is unfortunately pretty basic. But this is at least somewhat harder than it looks. Like the first Riffaroo fight, the main threat is falling into the pit and dying. Anything with a pit will instantly go up on the difficulty scale a little bit. The platforms will periodically flash red, then fall down, and if Tiny is jumping there, he will fall and take a hit of damage. You have to bait Tiny over these holes by jumping across them while they're flashing, so he'll jump over the gap after the platforms fall. It leaves most everything in the hands of the player, which is really refreshing after the first two bosses of this game are just waiting for attack patterns to end before bosses generically become vulnerable. Tiny's attacks don't change, but he will jump faster as he gets less health and less platforms will fall at a time. If you just want to survive, it's not difficult, but to make Tiny fall, you will have to get a bit riskier. If you really want to get fancy, you can potentially even jump on the same platform that he's already on, moving in and out with aerial movement to avoid getting crushed, although that's really pointless than practical. The first three bosses in this game, including Tiny, are supposedly working for Brio, who is trying to stop Cortex and Crash from collecting crystals. But every source after this says Tiny was created by and works for Cortex rather than Brio. And he's still working with Cortex in all future games. Regardless of whatever happened, Tiny doesn't seem like the hardest character to gain the allegiance of, and his dialogue in Crash 3 later is just generically wanting to kill Crash. The arena is some futuristic place with lab assistants going up elevators in the background, along with the floating platforms. The platforms could just be generic geometric shapes and fulfill their function, but they kinda go with the futuristic aesthetic. Despite just being a big, strong brute, his intro and music help to sell his character for what he's supposed to be. The only thing that's missing is Tiny doing some kind of attack at some point beyond just the jumping, but this is perfectly serviceable for what it is. NGin always fights an impressive-looking mech as opposed to his boss, Cortex, who just is usually seen on a dinky little hoverboard, a jetpack. While this boss is very good, the main thing that I don't like about it is the gimmick introduced here and never used anywhere else. You can shoot Wumpa Fruit with the circle button and it's not explained anywhere, so you'll probably be standing there for a couple minutes figuring out what you're supposed to do. In the remake they give a tip about what you're supposed to do, but that's not there in the original. I mean, in the original there's not even any animation of him throwing the Wumpa apples, they add that in. Regardless, once we're past tutorializing how to throw the apples, it does make for very fun gameplay. On to the boss. NGin has several different attacks and an intimidatingly long health bar. As you damage him, parts of his mech fall off, and that causes him to use other parts of his mech to attack. It's cool and thematic rather than just, I'm lower health so I will actually try now. These attacks look brutal as he shoots a laser out of his claw hands at the screen, and the last phase has him shooting a big disintegration laser to melt the platforms. While this is like other bosses where there are points of vulnerability, it's not quite as direct, as you have to aim to hit his glowing red weakness during various points rather than one super obvious break where anyone remotely familiar with platformers would be able to hit it. NGin actually tries to evade your attacks during the missile phase where he's preparing missiles to attack. The missile phase even has two different phases within it. The first one where missiles rain down from the sky when he has both missile launchers, and then the second phase where a single missile goes across the floor like a little shockwave you need to jump over. Neither of these are particularly complex or anything, but him having actual attack variety lets him catch a player off guard and makes the boss much more memorable. During the first phase, there is a designated period where NGin is trying to avoid you as he's powering up his laser claw cannons, but you can also hit the claws as they are firing the lasers if you're daring. Makes the boss much more interactive and fun. In the last phase, he directly forces you to attack his weak point as he is attacking, as he does his best to minimize his points of vulnerability, coming onto and off of the screen in quick intervals. Can be greedy and try to hit him more, or just get in one or two shots before running off, and it adds much more player freedom. NGin's characterization is nothing too complicated as the one super loyal, sycophantic minion of Cortex, but his actual presence here in the boss arena is very cool. He gets an intro and outro with dialogue with his robotic voice filter where almost none of the others do, and it helps to accentuate his uncanny design.
Cortex said, give the 20 crystals you collected to me!
There's a lot of care put into his animations. He's not just controlling the mech by pushing buttons. If you look at him closely, you can see he's controlling the mech with his movements, most obvious in the intro in Phase 1 when he has full arms to mirror his arm movements. He has more attacks than most any of the other bosses, but what makes him truly stand out from the others is how you damage him, making him a much more interactive and fun boss battle. This is probably NGin at his most intimidating in his intro too, giving a very strong impression of him and leaving a tough act for Cortex to follow. As harsh as I have been on first bosses, I do try to cut them a little bit of slack. Being a final boss, on the other hand, is a much more demanding role. You better put up a stellar performance as a final boss. Cortex in Crash 2 does not. He's a chase boss. At least when Bowser gets a chase boss, he usually has some sort of direct fight to go along with it, but Cortex here is just the chase and nothing else. And most chase bosses are usually you running away from the boss. In this case, you are the one chasing the boss. The chase has Cortex trying to rush to the end of the segment to get to a portal, and if he gets to it, you lose. This is the only way to fail, nothing here can kill you. When I remembered how this boss went, I remember that the boulders slowed you down when you hit them. And it makes sense to slow you down in a race, sure, that can help you bring you to the fail state. Those giant spiked balls, on the other hand, really look like they would kill you on contact. They even use the same asset in the water levels, and when you hit them there, they murder you horribly. When you bump into them here, though, same effect as the boulders, just a light bump noise and they slow you down. Why do they even have them at all? Now, whenever Cortex gets too far ahead, say maybe you hit a boulder or something, he looks back at you and just waits for you to catch up. When I say too far ahead, I mean if he remotely gets ahead of you at all. The obstacles are almost entirely pointless, because while they slow you down, Cortex will just stop and wait. He doesn't attack you during this time or anything. He doesn't even taunt you by laughing or something. He just sits there and waits for you to come kill him. You can clearly see that Cortex has his laser pistol in his hand during this boss, and we've seen him use it during the Crash 1 boss. Did he forget how to use it? Did he not remember to charge it up or something? At the very least, you could add some cool animation of him here taunting you to make it look less idiotic. You can't even say he's being a stereotypical overconfident villain, he just looks awful. Cortex looks back at Crash like he's some poor lost puppy or something. They put so much more work into NGin's animations by comparison that it makes you wonder if they just ran out of time on Cortex's. The aesthetic of a space chase is very cool and the artist puts some work into it to give a good boss atmosphere, but Cortex himself gets extremely minimal attention. I really don't know why in the remake they didn't add some animation here for when he turns back to look at you. They added random, unfunny laughter to the middle of Brio's Crash 2 talking head cutscene. How about here where it'd be thematically appropriate? Could they really not add Cortex laughing here? Is that so much to ask? Moving on, in this game, Cortex tricks Crash into getting the crystals for him, and does his best to block out communications from Coco and Brio who are trying to tell Crash to rebel and not help him.
Now listen carefully. These holograms are hard to maintain. During the course of my intellectual pursuits, I have stumbled across a force that threatens to destroy the world. The crystals are the only means of containing it. The fate of the world is at stake. It is imperative, therefore, that you bring them to me.
Are you there, Crash? Crash! Crash! Are you there, Crash? Are you there, Crash?
While it's kind of stupid that Crash goes along with Cortex's instructions and collects the crystals, his plan ultimately does work. It's not a good plan or anything, but at least gives him some potential to look competent. Said potential is then immediately squandered in this abysmal final battle. I mean, with how long he's kept up this ruse, you'd think he wouldn't have to escape in such a desperate fashion either, or could at least set up some kind of trap to kill Crash as he collects the crystals. With Cortex constantly looking behind himself to see if Crash is following along, you'd think maybe he's actually trying to lure Crash into a trap. Even if you go backwards, Even if you go back to the start of the entire section, Cortex will still wait for you. Maybe that was a dropped plot thread? I guess he just assumed NGin's mech would be enough to kill him, and this pathetic boss battle was just a desperation plan B? Cortex's character in this game as a whole is fine, but in this boss it's pitiful and makes him look pathetic, so I'm taking off some character points. He will gloat and have an evil laugh if he wins, but that is never ever going to happen. He has absolutely zero attacks, and you can't even count the hazards in the way his attacks since they can't kill you, and the slowdown doesn't matter since Cortex just waits. The only way to theoretically lose is not being used to controls. The one positive thing I will say for the boss weakness category is you can kill him as fast as you can get up to him. That's at least a decent idea for this boss, it's just executed horribly.
Crash! Coco! Stole the pretty crystals! Tiny, take them back in Gladiator Arena!
Crash 3 introduces time travel, and Tiny's boss fight takes place in a Roman gladiator arena. Cortex is there watching as the Emperor, and Tiny is chained to pillars which he easily breaks with his strength in the intro. The boss has two main attacks, one where he jumps at you and tries to crush you with his trident directly, which is very easy to avoid. The main attack that is threatening isn't directly from him though. Each time you hit him, the gates open up and unleash a horde of lions to try to devour Crash. You can technically hide off in a corner to avoid them, but this is the first boss and there are lots of moving enemies that can kill you here if you don't react quick. The variance at which the rates of the lions come out adds more unpredictability by comparison to how Crash 2's Ripperoo is always the same. There are a lot of great touches that add more atmosphere to this fight. The crowd of lab assistants watching will loudly boo you every single time you hit the boss, actively wanting you to get killed. Just like a real Coliseum. There's also a very obscure Easter egg exclusive to the remake. There's one arbitrary place you can stand in to be immune to all attacks, but if you stand there, the audience will throw cheese at you. The developers wanted to keep the exploit in to be true to the original, but acknowledging it with this gag is pretty hilarious. Tiny doesn't attack much directly in this boss, but has a lot of cool animations. When he's attacked, his trident will snap in two, and he will go get a new one to replace it from the spares on the rack. He will cheer the lions on as they go after you, roaring, and it looks pretty cool. This boss's difficulty isn't anything crazy, but it's in a very good place for a first boss, with the line attack being very threatening but also simple to answer. The atmosphere is what really carries this boss, as this one pretty much goes all out for it and does a great job glorifying Tiny, even if the boss itself is very easy.
Right. Now you've gone and done it. Them crystals are mine.
Dingodile is one of the most threatening looking of the animal minions and has a very cool design, even if he is like 90% crocodile and 10% dingo. In his intro, he's threatening to murder a baby penguin. I mean, you go, Dingodile. Those penguins try to spin you to death all the time in Crash 2, he probably deserves it. His one-liner before he goes to kill you is very cool and memorable. It makes him feel like he has more personality by comparison to Pinstripe, who is mostly just going off the shock value of having a real gun.
Break out the butter. I'm gonna make toast.
The sound design really helps to sell the power of his gun with the powerful sounding shots of his flamethrower as he fires shots into the air. And the sounds of the crystals being shattered from his gun really make it sound strong, and like something you don't want to get hit by. If the fire does hit you, you disintegrate into ash horribly, so they aren't hyping it up for nothing. Despite how confident he is, Dingodile has the intelligence to actually try to defend himself with his shield of crystals. I'm not sure how he magically summons them or whatever when they fall from the sky, but I guess it's part of the arena he chose, since he could choose to fight Crash anywhere based off the Warp Room technology. Dingodile shatters holes in his defensive wall of crystals as he shoots at you, and that makes the opening you need to go attack him by going between the openings in the rotating crystals. You can be patient and wait for a bigger opening, giving some fun opportunities for player freedom. Getting in to hit him isn't all that difficult. After you land a hit, the gas tank strapped to his back will start pulsating, get ready to explode, making big, loud warning noises before it's about to blow up. Depending on how many crystals you've broken, you'll have an easier time getting out and escaping, as you have to run back to the edge of the arena, while if it's just the bare minimum, you're more likely to get caught on some crystals. I think this is one of the more likely places for the player to die if they're impatient, but it's all directly within the player's control and adds a sense of fun beyond just a generic scripted boss battle. Dingodile's theme is the best track in the original Crash Trilogy, and helps add to Dingodile's memorability. They constantly spam this track during Crash Bash. It's pretty much one of the only tracks that's worth listening to outside of the original context of the game. Dingodile comes across as a merciless hunter with his gun, and has a strong amount of personality. The boss itself isn't particularly difficult or anything, but it's fun for how brief it is.
I am Dr. Nefarious Tropy, master of time and the creator of the very time twister machine you see before you.
NTropy is one of the more serious antagonists of the series. In the intro, Uka Uka escapes his prison and Cortex begs for another chance. Uka Uka brings in NTropy to ensure that everything goes according to plan, and to make sure Cortex does it right this time. If anything, it's kind of weird that NTropy is just a random third boss before even NGin is fought in this game for some reason. I suppose you can credit it to him being extremely full of himself, because during his time twister dialogue he calls the protagonist stupid for not knowing what they're getting themselves into.
You little vermin are way too stupid to understand what you're getting yourselves into.
I mean, Crash is very stupid, so he's somewhat right to be. When his boss fight starts, he starts winding up a giant clock with his face on it, showing how narcissistic he is. The boss itself has very powerful looking attacks with the giant lasers and fireballs he shoots out of his tuning fork at Crash, which home in on the player's location. You can technically outrun them by sliding, although most casual players probably won't realize that. The only time I see players dying all that much to this is if they don't know to crouch under the higher up fireballs. He fires some too low to crouch under, and some too high to jump over, and some players who are having problems with depth perception may not realize which it is. Aside from simply not knowing how to crouch, this is the only other way players end up dying in this boss. When NTropy is done shooting his projectile volley, he will get exhausted and create an array of platforms for you to traverse over. I don't know why he does that, but he does it, for some reason. Yes, if you take too long, he will kill you, or you can fall off, but it's not a remotely hard set of platforms to go over. I really don't like this mechanic very much, and it makes no real thematic sense why he's doing it. It's not like he's taunting you to go across or anything even. He just creates a path for you to kill him while he's tired out. It doesn't make any sense. In the Game Boy Advance game, Crash Entranced, Uka Uka again recruits NTropy after being frustrated with Cortex's failures, and NTropy is the final boss. In that game, his boss fight is similar to this one, but is made much harder because he's the final boss. They greatly improve on this fight. The platforms are at varying heights, and it's way harder to get across them in this version. That would be very cool to have here in Crash 3, but no such luck. The music is very weird, but it does communicate a strong sense of character, and is one of the most unique tracks in the game. After each time you hit NTropy, the arena shifts to a different time period. It's generally implied that this fight is supposed to take place inside of the Time Twister itself, because Uka Uka and Cortex comment that you broke it by killing NTropy, and that nobody knows what it will do after that. The music, atmosphere, and attacks give a cool otherworldly feeling that helps to make NTropy feel as important as he is, and not just a generic boss number 3. Unfortunately, this boss is still held back a lot because of low difficulty and non-threatening attacks, though. In this version of the fight that we have in Crash 3, I really don't like the rigid platforms here from a thematic perspective or a gameplay perspective.
So, you want to go a few rounds? When this is over, we'll see who is obsolete.
This fight is in a gimmicky space shooter style instead of the usual platforming style, which generally makes this a pretty significant downgrade to NGin's Crash 2 boss fight. Because this is a gimmick style, the difficulty has to remain relatively low. You do get to do a bit in this gameplay style before the boss with a plane level, but it's not that similar to this, so it's good this doesn't go too crazy. That said, this boss comes across too easy for my taste. Each hit you take does at most 10% of your health bar, so you'll take around 15 hits or something to die. Any deaths will mostly be shock value of a player getting used to a new gameplay style, and not much else. For NGin's 2 very long health bars in the 2 phases, the fight mostly feels long rather than challenging or particularly exciting. Each of the robot's pieces are attackable and are flashing yellow, and you can destroy them to disable those individual attacks. You have to destroy them all, so the boss actively gets easier as it goes on rather than harder. Eventually, the phase will change to phase 2, and it will get hard again, but if anything is kind of weird, this is where the big difficulty spike is, at the middle of the fight. Every other boss in the series, and in 99% of other platformers, gets harder as they go, rather than some weird difficulty curve of hard, then easy, then hard, then easy again. With absolutely all attacks of Phase 2 going on at once, it can be slightly overwhelming for a new player and is not especially well designed, as firing a billion projectiles is the only way for him to kill you and it takes him literally 15 hits to do so. The cannon on the bottom of NGin's mech in Phase 2 only very briefly glows yellow, but it always is vulnerable despite that. The fact that this weakness is not as obvious as the others is a bad thing, because it is his most powerful attack and the hardest to avoid. The only way to stop it is to destroy that cannon, and the animation for that one is more subtle than the others, so new players will take longer to realize it. This is a basic space shooter, so it's not hard to learn how to control. Just move and shoot. But the movement controls are a bit awkward to get used to when figuring out your positioning in the 3D space, as the camera rotates when you move, and NGin also moves around. By all means, the boss gets way easier as you destroy his cannons, but with only one point of vulnerability left, it can be annoying for some players to hit on a first playthrough. The big comparison I would make for this boss is to Dr. Call from Cuphead, another shoot-'em-up boss against a robot. As you destroy every individual attacking mechanism of that boss, another one comes up to replace it, adding more strategy to which one you want to get rid of because it destroys an attack but adds another one. I wouldn't expect something at that level of complexity or difficulty out of Crash Bandicoot, but actively getting easier as destroy each piece feels bad, even if it technically makes sense. Something else should happen when he gets low on health to some kind of desperation attack, like in the previous game's NGin battle. The atmosphere on the moon and in space is cool and all, but I don't think he shows as much character in this one as in his previous appearance, despite having more dialogue due to the time twister. He doesn't animate at all inside of the mech, and his dialogue is significantly less threatening. Not that you can even hear what he's saying because of the horrible sound mixing in this boss. The sound of your guns are going to be constantly going off, because every player always holds down shoot 100% of the time. That's loud enough, but it's even more loud when you shoot at his robot's vulnerable points. This is more of a concern than just the dialogue. This constant bombardment of bullets is so constant that it even drowns out the music. Bullets on metal do not make for a particularly memorable music piece. The theme itself is okay if you could actually listen to it, but I'm deducting points off because of this.
Now that you have gathered all the crystals, All we have to do is take them from you!
This isn't just another boss battle against Cortex, despite him having the health bar in this fight. If anything, Uka Uka comes across as more of the star. What separates this one from some others is more the uniqueness of the two attacks going on at the same time. You are in a 2 vs 2 with Crash attacking Cortex, while your mask Aku Aku is fighting Cortex's mask, Uka Uka. Uka Uka is presented throughout the story as much more powerful than Cortex, and it fits here with the fact you cannot attack him at all and are just focusing down Cortex, making for a thematic and memorable experience you don't really see anywhere else in this series. For each phase, the two masks are fighting each other with different attacks, starting with an anime beam struggle as they rotate around, creating a big laser for you to dodge, then spinning around in a cartoon fight to create a fast-moving whirlwind. Then for the last phase, they create a gigantic explosion with a big hitbox. Cortex's attacks don't change very much throughout the fight, but he's still actively attacking you during all of this with his mines and blaster shots from his gun. If only one of these two attacks from either Uka Uka or Cortex were going off, the fight would be really pathetic. But with both, it is slightly challenging and is pretty fun to navigate. This isn't even teamwork so much as two fights going on at once that makes it very cool and memorable. Cortex does not look like he is trying particularly hard. The cutscenes in the Time Twister, especially the one before this battle, have Cortex sound like he's about ready to give up.
Once again, you have outsmarted and outspun my best henchman. I should be rather upset, shouldn't I?
It is Uka Uka forcing him to keep going, as he drags him along for the rest of the ride as an embodiment of rage. When Cortex becomes vulnerable, you hit him around on the floor like a ragdoll, and he looks pretty pathetic before Uka Uka has to go save him. It can come across less directly threatening than the others, but it is still really great characterization. Whether or not it's intentional, which it blatantly isn't, this game sort of plants the seeds for what would later become Cortex's more pathetic, less directly antagonistic characterization seen in later games after Naughty Dog no longer was in control of the series. The mines aren't just hitboxes that can kill you, but they can also hit Cortex's corpse to blow him away, make it harder to hit him into the middle, potentially forcing you to repeat the current phase. It is somewhat harder than it looks to hit him in, and requires several hits angled correctly without the mines interfering. Regardless of whatever your take on Cortex's character is here, it's a really memorable double battle between four characters. The fact Aku Aku exists also increases the difficulty more, as his existence means you are banned from bringing Aku Aku masks into this fight. You can't cheese it by dying a bunch of times and getting a free pity mask to take a hit for you. The music is also some of the best in the series and helps to really sell this as an epic confrontation, even if Cortex is kind of defeatist about the whole thing. So we went through the bosses in chronological order, giving scores as we went, but we haven't bothered to actually rank them by quality. That's what we have the end of the video for. Before I show off the full list, let's look at the bottom 3 and the top 5. For third worst place, we have the Komodo Brothers. The boss is obscenely easy, the characterization is very poor, with Joe existing to just mess up Mo more than anything else. While the character designs are kinda nice, that's about it. Third worst is technically tied with second worst at 14 points, but I'm giving it to Cortex's Space Chasin' 2 as the worst boss, given it's massively disappointing to be the final boss. A near unfailable finale with absolutely no attacks is bottom of the barrel stuff here. Last and least, we have Papu Papu, who can't even score points in the double digits. As bad as Cortex is, Papu Papu is simply too minimalist to the point most anyone who could install Unity could probably make this boss battle for themselves. For how hard and prominent the tribal levels are, their leader being this pathetic makes him the obvious worst pick. On the positive side, we'll highlight the top 5. NTropy clocks in at 5th with 29 points thanks to his intimidating persona and memorable atmosphere, only held back by the platforming segments being a bit too simplistic and janky. Dingodile burns his way into 4th with 30.5 points, being extremely solid all round in both aesthetics and gameplay, with the only caveat being his very low difficulty. Going into the top 3, we get a big jump up to 35 points with Brio, who has the strongest sense of individual character and atmosphere of just about any boss, but suffers slightly from predictable attack patterns. With 35.5 points, NGin from Crash 2 comes in next, being the best boss in terms of gameplay easily, without any real weaknesses in any category. And for the grand finale, the winner of the whole thing, we get Cortex and Uka Uka from Crash 3, narrowly clutching it out in a very competitive race, with just 36 points. This fight is less about Cortex's individual characterization as it is about portraying his relationship with Uka Uka, and the simultaneous battles at once was just too much for me to not give it the top spot. That said, I would have been perfectly happy with any of the top 3 winning it. Looking over the rest of the overall tier list, the bulk of the pack ends up somewhere between 21 to 25. Pinstripe is really struggling to stay out of the bottom 3 given his terrible gameplay. There's enough impact on the world through Crash 1's storytelling that he manages to stay out of it, especially with the Potteroo gangster minions he has. Crash 1's Cortex is kind of the bare minimum for a final boss and is never something I thought was particularly good, but the bar isn't really that high to get 6th place. Going on to difficulty scores, this is generally the most objective category. Keep in mind that this is out of 10, not 5, so NGin from Crash 2 at the top is a mere 5 out of 10. Still, he's a standout in this category, and when every boss is so easy in these games, it's a pretty good achievement. The bosses with a 3 are there mostly for having bottomless pits in the boss, and Cortex's Space Chase reaches the bottom despite being a final boss. You could technically argue Pinstripe higher because he will probably die to his gotcha shock value death of not understanding how he works, but after that the boss is unlosable. We get some more positive scores with boss attacks. Space Chase Cortex is at 0 for having absolutely no form of attack, and even the environmental hazards doing nothing. NGin from 2 has by far the biggest attack variety, but Cortex and Uka Uka's attacks going at the same time is what really sells them to be up in the same tier. Brio has a lot of attacks, but I really would have preferred if the monster phase was a bit more complex. For boss weakness, both of the NGin fights are above the rest with the ability to attack them almost whenever you want by comparison to having to wait for openings. But 2's is superior because of the better engagement curve of the fight in general. Dingodile offers a ton of player freedom in how quick and risky or slow and safe the player wants to go thanks to the wall of crystals, which I really like. Papu Papu could be argued as the worst since he has almost no mercy invincibility to just immediately go hit him again. But I hate the aesthetic of how the Komodo Bros damage themselves even more, with Joe randomly waddling across the floor to bump into Mo. Characterization is the strongest category for these guys in general. They put a lot of effort into making these be realized characters and not generic bosses. Cortex has by far the strongest characterization in 3 thanks to the dynamic with Uka Uka, but you also get a big sense of Brio's characterization in 1 as he really embraces the mad scientist aesthetic to the fullest. On the other hand of embracing a stereotype negatively, you have Papu Papu who does almost nothing with his theme. His Crash Bash boss is a much better example of what he could have been. The characterization category is the main thing saving a lot of these otherwise very simplistic and mediocre boss fights, such as the Ripperoos and Pinstripe. Atmosphere is somewhat correlated with characterization, but not entirely. It's based around the arena and other flavor bits that don't directly tie to the character of the boss. The original Cortex on the Burning Island and Tiny in the Gladiator Arena make the biggest standout jumps in this category. Seriously, that Coliseum aesthetic is just fantastic. If that boss was later in the game and given some more complexity, it very easily could have cracked top 5, given Dingodile is up there right now. I'm more generous with this category, given the lowest I give is a 4, but this is something Naughty Dog generally did very well with. Last but not least, music. It's a subjective category, so I only capped this one at a mere 5 points rather than 10. The top 3 listed here of Dingodile, Cortex and Uka Uka, and Brio are the only ones I'd really listen to outside of the game, with Brio's improving the most with his Sane Trilogy remix. And with that, that's all the categories. What are your thoughts on our rankings? Do Do you agree with our top picks, or do you think some bosses deserve a higher or lower spot? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest content. And as always, share your favorite Crash Bandicoot memories and suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching!